So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for coming, and thank you to CMS for organizing the symposium. So this panel is Access to Protection in Unaccompanied Minors. And we have our expert panelists here to discuss. We have Margaret Stock, attorney at Cascadia Cross-Border Law Group. Anna Cabot, who's a clinical fellow at the Asylum and Human Rights Clinic at the University of Connecticut. And Anna Gallagher, attorney from Maggio in Qatar, who's going to be specifically talking about unaccompanied minors. And I guess I'll just start with some brief opening remarks. And I should say also, I'm Megan McKenna with Kids in Need of Defense and KIND. And KIND finds pro bono attorneys with firms, corporations, and law schools who volunteer to represent unaccompanied children referred to us who are in deportation proceedings. We've been referred more than 6,000 children since we opened our doors in 2009. And we also have a pilot return and reintegration program in Guatemala to help children returning alone to the United States. Access to protection and unaccompanied children is certainly foremost in the minds of many today because of the current crisis we're experiencing regarding the historic numbers of these children entering the United States. Their number has risen tenfold since 2011, with a projected 70,000 or more coming this fiscal year. And they're primarily from Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Next year, the U.S. government is predicting 127,000 children to come. The average number of children coming per day in May was 400. 1,000 came over one weekend in May. And the children are coming younger than ever before. We're seeing many more under 13s, and there's a much larger percentage of girls than there has been in the past. It's now 60% boys, 40% girls. And many of the girls are victims of sexual violence. In a March 2014 report by UNHCR on unaccompanied children in Central America and Mexico, found that the primary reason for these children's flight is increasing violence in Central America, driven by drug cartels and a variety of other transnational criminal elements, and that the majority of these children should be screened for international protection. Many described fleeing forced gang recruitment and violence for refusing to join with criminal groups, as well as threats and harm to family members. Children referred to KIND confirm this analysis, as do several reports by NGOs that work with these children. This has become a refugee-like crisis. And yesterday, as many of you have heard, President Obama issued a memo directing FEMA to lead and coordinate the federal response through what's being called an Interagency Unified Coordination Group. And FEMA will be coordinating the housing, medical care, and transportation needs of the children. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson has declared the situation level 4, which is the highest of contingency planning within DHS. 2 weeks ago, the government started housing children at an Air Force base in Lackland. Lackland Air Force Base, which is San Antonio, which can hold 1,200 children, and I think they're just about filled to capacity. And as early as Friday, it will start placing children at a naval base in Ventura County. And this facility can hold about 600 children. We've been told that HHS is providing basic services at Lackland and will also do so at the naval base, but of course many are concerned about these children and their protection. This current and fast-changing situation of unaccompanied children is a real-time case study in access to protection and its barriers. It could be an opportunity for creative solutions and a reworking of the entire system to ensure meaningful access for children alone in our immigration system to protection. Time will tell, and it's certainly a work in progress. So I'll stop here, and I'll let Margaret speak more generally about access to protection and territorial access in particular.
Thank you very much. I think we're the breaking news panel. I don't know how Don got the White House to do that yesterday, but he's trying to boost attendance. My job here is to just briefly review the rules regarding territorial access, which I think are pretty well illustrated with the crisis that's going on the southern border. The reason so many people are managing to show up at the border is because they're from a neighboring country. But the vast majority of the world's population of refugees are not able to access the United States borders. I mean, they're just not able to get here. So we're seeing kind of an interesting event happening in large part because it is our close neighbor that's experiencing these problems that are causing the young people to head north for protection. But I'll start by just using a favorite quote from Nehemiah Robinson, 1953. If a refugee has succeeded in eluding the frontier guards, he is safe. If he is not, it is his hard luck. And that's a pretty good illustration of the rules regarding access to asylum. You have to get to the country. You have to get to the United States if you want to claim asylum. Mark von Sternberg talked about this a little bit earlier when he mentioned the 1993 case, Sale v. Haitian Centers Council, the one infamous case, as Mark described it, in which the Supreme Court of the United States basically said you don't have a right if you're outside the borders of the United States, you got to get here first. And that's one of the reasons, of course, why young people are heading to our border, because the word has gotten out that you got to get here or you cannot claim protection. There is a tension, of course, between principles and reality out there in the world. This is starkly illustrated by the reaction to the Obama administration's announcement yesterday. I think the concern of opponents wasn't for the factors that are driving the children north to America. The concern was numbers. You know, there's just too many people. Nobody seemed to be raising any concerns about the fact that there might be violence in Central America. There might be problems with the treatment of women. There might be drugs and criminality. And those factors might be driving people north. No one was talking about the solutions to those problems. Instead, they were worried about the numbers. And there's got to be a way to stop all these people from coming here. And I think that is the best illustration of this big tension between principles and reality. We have these principles set out in the law and set out in policy that we want to protect people. But when it comes to being overwhelmed by large numbers of people seeking protection, we often have a completely different view. But let's get back to a little bit of the ways these things play out. We know from American history that we didn't have the current concerns about territorial access long ago. In fact, I was born in Boston, I grew up in Boston, and there's a famous monument to the Irish potato famine in Boston. There's one in New York, not so famous, but we brag in Boston about how we were a refuge for all these people who are fleeing starvation in Ireland. And yet today, fleeing starvation in a foreign country is not a grounds for claiming asylum in the United States of America. It's a ground for being summarily sent back to the country, because the law, of course, limits people from claiming asylum in the United States. There's only 5 protected grounds, and if you're not in one of those categories, you're just out of luck. So we have 2 main ways that we stop people from getting here to claim asylum: external deterrence methods and then internal ones. And I'll just run through those quickly because I know everybody here wants to get to the discussion about the late breaking news topics and unaccompanied minors, which Anna and others are going to be discussing. So let me just run through it. We have these non-entree practices, as James Hathaway and Alexander Nave call them, external deterrence. First of all, there's the visa system. To get to the United States, most people in the world have to get on a plane or get on a boat somewhere, and they have to get permission to come here before they get on the plane for the most part. So we have an active system to prevent people that we think might be refugees or asylees from coming to the United States. You can't get a visa as a visitor if you're planning to claim asylum in the United States. That's a grounds for denying your visa. We do have a few special visas for certain types of refugees, and of course we do admit people as refugees once they're properly processed overseas, but we spend a lot of time trying to prevent people from coming to the United States lawfully in order to claim asylum. We have robust systems for checking passengers getting on airplanes in foreign countries, pre-inspection processes in some countries, penalties on airlines. We lean on our neighbors, Canada and Mexico, to make sure that they don't let people into their country that we think might be planning to claim asylum here in the United States. Mark mentioned the Interdiction at Sea programs, very robust programs to seek out people that might be getting on boats and coming to the United States trying to claim asylum. We try to intercept them and send them back before they get here, thereby preventing them from attempting to claim access to our asylum system. Our practices have differed over time, and I have a paper coming out with the center where I kind of go through the history of all that, but the bottom line is that we do spend an enormous amount of time and energy trying to keep the numbers down, trying to keep the people who might have a claim to protection from getting to the United States, because then they won't be able to claim it. And of course we have summary removal processes, like the expedited removal process has been in the news lately in the context of the lesson plans regarding credible fear. A note on those, basically what happens is someone's deemed to be eligible for expedited removal, but they're given a credible fear interview. And the standard is deemed now to be too generous for passing a credible fear interview. And it seems to be, again, driven by this idea that there's too many people, who are passing the credible fear interview. It's almost like too many students getting A's. So what we need to do is, reduce the number, and the way we reduce the number is we change the standard. Again, no concern for, well, maybe there's just a lot of people that deserve protection. That doesn't seem to be playing into the calculus at all. It's just simply a matter of too many are passing the test, therefore we need to make the test harder. So the final one I'll just mention, again, Mark talked about this a little bit, is safe third country agreements, or what we call burden shifting arrangements, where we work out a deal with somebody else to try to get them to take responsibility for somebody who has a claim so that we don't have to. And these are generally the rundown on the external deterrent type of systems that we have set up. But then if the external systems fail and somebody actually gets here, we have a robust system for trying to prevent them from claiming asylum here in the United States. The law itself, of course, I mentioned that earlier. We have a very, very strict laws about who's eligible. We have kind of two groups of people, the worthy people and the unworthy people. And the unworthy people are people, for example, who are starving in their home country. Those people should just go back home. That's not a protected ground. Economic refugees. You hear in the case law a lot of derogatory remarks about people. People who are economic refugees are considered unworthy. So you're supposed to be in this category of worthy refugees, and we all kind of know who the worthy refugees are. I guess it's, you know it when you see it. One of those famous things. And it turns out the worthy refugees are oftentimes people who come from higher socioeconomic categories and are better able to articulate their claims in a manner that's convincing to the people who are making the decisions about worthiness. And people who are possibly less educated or don't have access to lawyers for some reason turn out to be less worthy, not as a practical matter, but as a matter of the way that the system ends up working. So internally, we have the law itself as a deterrent. We have the expanded use of detention. Others are going to be talking about that. Detention at the border, and then at the entry point. Conditions in our detention centers, which seem to be operating in some respects as a deterrent. My famous example of this is from a book that I urge everybody to read if you haven't, Do They Hear You When You Cry? It's the saga of a woman from Africa trying to claim protection in the United States, and she talks about how the detention center conditions often caused her to think that she should give up her claim to asylum. And of course she worked with her attorney and ultimately prevailed and was released from a detention center. But the book talks in great detail about the struggle she had mentally, with do I really want to keep putting up with this system that I'm stuck in order to claim asylum, or is it so bad here that I should just give up and go back home? And our detention system does operate as a way to prevent people from claiming asylum, because many people do give up. We also, of course, have our filing deadlines and our limits on work permission. The limit on work permission clearly was put into place to stop people from claiming asylum, on the thinking being that people were coming to the United States claiming asylum merely to get permission to work, and that was a bad thing, and therefore we should stop them from working until they get past a certain point in the process, at which point, we figure they're serious. So at that point, we'll give them permission to work. The U.S. doesn't operate with doesn't have some systems that they use elsewhere in the world. We don't have special asylum seeker housing, except perhaps for children now. We don't have restrictions on movement. We don't tell people seeking asylum in the United States that once they've claimed asylum that they are stuck in one spot and they can't leave. But we do have a lot of other robust systems that operate as limits on how people can claim asylum here in the United States. And why do we do this? Well, we have a lot of fear here in America. We see the asylum and refugee system as a vulnerability, and we want to protect our country from the vulnerabilities of this system, rather than viewing it as scholars and people in the refugee protection system might as a system that's designed to protect people who are in serious harm. We often view it as a vulnerability. We think that, for example, terrorists might try to seek asylum in the United States, might use it as an excuse to attack us. And there have been a very small, extremely tiny number of cases where that has been the case. But that tiny number of cases seems to get blown out of proportion and cited every single time someone talks about the asylum system. So we want to put in systems to prevent asylum seekers who would do us harm from doing us harm. We want to also stop the flood of asylum seekers. That's a recurring theme and the one that we've heard since the president made his announcement yesterday. And then, of course, we think that people are using the asylum system to avoid migration controls. And of course, there is a lot of evidence that this is the case, but it's not put the best way to say avoid migration controls. I think a better way to put it would be to explain that the legal immigration system in America is broken, and one alternative way that people use to accomplish their worthy human goals of being reunited with their families or accepting a job in the United States might be to attempt to use the asylum system as one avenue to become reunited with their families. So for example, if you are from El Salvador and you are on a 20-year waiting list for a visa to be reunited with your family, you might make a decision that you're going to go to the United States border and ask for protection. Not because you're a fraudulent asylum seeker, but simply because conditions are difficult in your home country. You're eligible to immigrate to the United States eventually, but you're on a 15 or 20-year waiting list, and you simply can't bear it to wait that long. And so you seek asylum as a way to speed things up, if you will, because the legal immigration system in the United States is indeed broken. So that's a factor that we need to think about when we consider these refugee and asylum protection systems. People move for lots of reasons or want to move for lots of reasons. And people's motivations are often quite complicated. I'm about out of time, so I just want to end on with a brief mention that one of the things that puzzles me and concerns me in the current refugee and asylum system is that in the United States we seem to be losing sight of our principles in many respects and focusing more on kind of a downward spiral in our protection when we're threatened by the numbers. And I think that is illustrated best by what happened in the last 24 hours in response to the president's announcement. But I know that Anna and others are going to be talking about that more, so I'll close here and give you all a chance to go into more detail about that.
Hi, my name is Unaccompanied and I work at the University of Connecticut in the Asylum and Human Rights Clinic. And I feel like a bit of a parenthetical on this panel because I'm not going to be talking about unaccompanied minors. That being said, I do think that this is actually quite a good time for what I am going to be talking about, and that is the treatment of Mexican asylum seekers in the U.S. And it follows very well on what Mark and Margaret talked about in terms of, they talked a lot about legal impediments for seeking asylum in the U.S., the interdiction and the other issues. And what I'm going to be talking about is what happens with Mexican asylum seekers, where it's not so much legal problems that get in their way, but Mexican asylum seekers confront a combination of flaws and discretionary parts of the asylum system. And that acts as a real impediment for them getting asylum. Excuse me, I'm kind of trying to dovetail here and it's getting a little bit confused. All right, so before I was at the University of Connecticut, and I haven't been there long, I worked in El Paso. So I worked with Mexican asylum seekers on the border. And I don't know how many other people in this room have also worked on the border, but it does feel kind of like the Wild West there. It feels very different from work I've done with asylum seekers away from the border. And I mean, that's been the East Coast for me, so far away from that particular border. What I believe happens with Mexican asylum seekers is that you get the fear that Margaret was talking about in the general asylum seeker, and you get that in the general asylum system, and you get that amplified with Mexican asylum seekers. You get fear of opening the floodgates because we share a border with Mexico, and because the conflict there is really, maybe not at its peak, but is very potent at this point. You also get political interests with Mexico. Mexico being a huge trading partner of the U.S., and the U.S. being pretty deeply involved in funding and organizing the drug war in Mexico, which is the source of a lot of the violence. So you not only get fear, you get political interest, all working to prevent Mexican asylum seekers from getting asylum in the U.S. And so this was very clear and incredibly frustrating while I was working on the border. It really felt like at every point there was any sort of question or any discretionary element of the asylum system, my Mexican asylum clients would get slammed. And so this is a somewhat anecdotal talk and paper, because a lot of this is hard to quantify. It's not in statutes, it's hard to kind of get statistics about it, and so it's a lot of things I experienced while I was there. But what I'm going to talk about are the various different aspects of the asylum system where it wasn't a legal impediment, but it was a discretionary, or it was other sorts of impediments. And people who represent asylum seekers throughout the room will find all of these very familiar. I'm not saying that these all only affect Mexican asylum seekers. I'm saying that as a group, they are focused on Mexican asylum seekers, but they're problems that all asylum seekers experience. Okay, and so the problems start at entry, as I'm sure many of you can imagine. A lot of the Mexican asylum seekers I represented and came to the southern border and asked for asylum and were admitted, interviewed, and then given a credible fear interview. Some were detained and some were released on parole. So they've gotten over the first hurdle, which is the border. And so the U.S., unlike people interdicted at sea, doesn't have that issue. Well, has other issues at the border. But so at entry, I mean, one of the biggest and one of the strangely most straightforward problems is that people from Mexico and from other countries who come to the border and who try to follow the rules are put in defensive asylum proceedings. Now, I know most of you know the difference here, but people in defensive asylum proceedings see a judge and go through an adversarial process. People in affirmative asylum proceedings see an asylum officer and go through a non-adversarial interview. So, people who come to the border, ask for protection, try to follow the rules, get put in the defensive proceedings. The defensive proceedings are more difficult to traverse without an attorney. They're more costly. They're less likely to succeed, and kind of ironically, they're much more expensive for the government. Okay, I gotta speed this up. Anyway, it seems unfair that people who come to the border, who follow the rules, are put in the more difficult proceedings. So that's one of the problems at entry. Another problem with people who come to the border to ask for protection is that they are usually interviewed directly, immediately, by a Border Patrol officer. It's a long, detailed interview, much like a credible fear interview, going over a lot of the same parts that they eventually have to attest. And the problem for many Mexican asylum seekers, especially since a lot of the conflict in Mexico has been in states adjacent to the US border, in Tijuana and Chihuahua, is that people get to the Mexican asylum seekers fleeing to the border are often very recent trauma survivors. Often, sometimes within hours of trauma, even of personal injury, they get to the border and ask for protection. And at the border, they're then immediately interviewed. I had a client who had a bullet wound in his arm who came to the border to ask for asylum. He was sent to the hospital, which was nice, and given quite heavy, attended to and given quite heavy painkillers, and then brought back to the border and interviewed. And so he has been shot 6 hours earlier. He's on painkillers, and they do a very detailed interview with him and make him swear to the veracity of the information that they give. Then, of course, people in this asylum seeker and people in that situation, a few weeks later have a credible fear interview. Again detailed, again sworn to. And these interviews, especially interviews given when there's recent trauma, have issues of credibility, because trauma affects people's memory, trauma affects people's ability to communicate. Oh my goodness. Okay, excuse me guys. Anyway, these interview procedures raise issues of credibility, which often comes up later on and causes immigration judges to be able to kind of summarily reject claims, because the Mexican asylum seekers can be judged to be not credible. Okay, I'm going to touch briefly on detention. Arbitrary standards of detention, which Mark brought up earlier. Yes, for people who have credible fear, they are able, at least officially, to be released, but it's an extremely discretionary procedure. And a lot of what's happening to Mexican asylum seekers on the border is when families come across people with the same immigration history, with the same claims, especially usually a father gets detained and not released, and the rest of the family, because they don't want to try and detain children, are released. This tends to, for one thing, keep the Mexican asylum problem at the border. If your husband is detained in a detention center on the border, usually families resist moving away. The other problem is, generally, a family's breadwinner is in detention, and while people with humanitarian parole can get work permits, there's a lot of financial pressure through this system. Another issue is with reasonable fear interviews in detention. While 98% of credible fear hearings go on within 14 days, the average for a reasonable fear interview for people who've had removal orders before, that average is 113 days. And so people facing that sort of time in detention sometimes will relinquish their claim just in order to get out of prison. Okay, I'm unfortunately out of time, and I apologize that I haven't been able to get to everything. I'd just like to say that on top of legal impediments to asylum, the kind of point of this was to show how there are discretionary impediments to asylum, which in the case of Mexican asylum seekers have kind of all been focused on them and really can act as an incredible barrier for genuine asylum claims. And so in our focus on reforms, these discretionary issues have to be part of the focus as well as the legal.
Hi, folks. I'm a practitioner, so the majority of my pro bono practice involves representation, actually, of unaccompanied minors. And it's interesting to me to see the trend because several years ago that wasn't so. It was primarily adults. It was, we had a large LGBT practice. And over the past 2 years, almost all of our pro bono cases are unaccompanied minors, and we have a significant pro bono caseload. So it's interesting because we're tracking the trends of what's happening at the border. So as I was listening to my colleagues here, I thought a couple things. I was struck by what Margaret said about keeping people out, and Anna, the restrictions on asylum. And so two things. How it did seem to be easier before, and how our policies are a little bit insane. So easier before, I'll use the example of my father. So my father's an old Irish guy, literally from Ireland. And he says he voted with his feet because he came from Donegal, which is in the upper northwest, the poorest section of Ireland. And he was the last of 7, and there was nothing for him. So he did vote for his feet, and he traveled through England, Canada, and then came to the United States, and all he needed was a letter from one of his American cousins saying he's a good guy and I think he'll work, right? And he borrowed the bank account of a cousin to show that he had enough money, and he came to the United States and he did well. And they accepted him, and he voted with his feet. And I feel like we were, in some ways, a kinder and a gentler and a more empathetic nation then, because I'm sure my father wouldn't get in now, or he'd be like my undocumented cousins that are here, okay? And then I was thinking about insanity. They define it as taking the same action over and over again and expecting a different result. And I feel like that is what we are doing at the border with enforcement. So we tighten restrictions, we put more guards there. We throw the young Mexicans back because that's what's happening, right? So Mexican kids get thrown back, don't even really get questioned about their fear. And we think that's going to somehow reduce the numbers. And in fact, we've seen the numbers double and triple. And I think it's 66,000 next year, or 100,000 they're expecting. 127,000 they're expecting next year. So I don't think it's working, right? So I just want to talk about very practical things for the academics in this room to think about, and the research folks, because I feel like when we do advocacy, right, it's great for us to talk to you all, and you to get the stories from us, and then for you to formalize the research and see if it matches up to and we can present, strong arguments for policy, right? So the differences I see. So, who's traveling? Over the last several years, the kids that were traveling before, that I see, now I'm not talking about the numbers, were boys, older, with less opportunities. So the last couple cases I had, I'll give you an example, was a young man who was the youngest of his family, who the family was sending money back to get him educated. He was very happy there. He did not want to come, right? But his elderly parents couldn't protect him anymore from the gangs, okay? So he came up, and this is a child from a solid family. I mean, not a wealthy family. But the journey he had to make was 25 days with a group of 17 people, and he was the only minor, okay? And then we had another, I'm getting a lot of grannies and granjas, that's how we call them in Ireland, who are sending the grandkids up. Now, they traditionally raised the kids and kept them there and hoped that the parents would get status and perhaps, they could immigrate later, and that's not happening. I got 2 little girl sisters who fled, and of course the board says these aren't particular social groups, these people don't need protection. 2 little sisters who lived in a village where they started seeing young girls killed and assassinated by gang members because they did things, this was a particularly horrible case, did things that young girls around the world would do. Maybe they have a boyfriend here, they don't like the boyfriend, and then they get a different boyfriend. But the problem in that case was the boyfriends were from different gangs. So the new gang members, and she broke up with them, and one gang member then assassinated her. So these 2 little girls growing into puberty, the mother became terrorized, and they come up. And the only way they can get them up is through paying coyotes. So that's who's traveling. What happens at the border? At the border, most of the kids I have, I would imagine some get through, but when they arrive at the border, they're identified, they're taken into custody, they're placed with Health and Human Services, and then there are medical exams, there was a study on their educational level, and then they try to find family members to reunite them. When they find the family members, I don't know what the number, I feel like it takes about between 30 to 60 days, but I don't know.
No, it's 30 days, the average.
Okay. Okay, good. So it was 30 days because I had kids that came up after 60 days. So 30 days, they're in that process for 30 days. Then when they identify a family member, they are transported to where that family member is, right? So what's interesting is, so UNHCR did this report that I think our UNHCR rep mentioned, that 58, and they identified that 58% of all these kids coming have international protection needs. The harms that they face are primarily gang-related or family violence, okay? Mind you, when you hear those numbers too, mind you that most of the Mexican kids are thrown back. So the lucky ones are the ones that get up and get over, right, and are reunited with their families. So then they come up. I'm just giving you the sort of the lifeline of a case. They come up. At some point, their venue is changed. That means the judge recognizes that they're in another jurisdiction, and the case is transferred, right? And they go into immigration court, and that's when we come into play, if they get an attorney, okay? In immigration court, and the interesting thing I've seen recently, I was in juvenile court last week, is that they seem to be closing more of these cases. So I think there's 56 immigration courts across the country. I think 20 of those have juvenile dockets. That means special initial hearing days where it's only kids. And there's child-friendly procedures, and the judges that I've seen are quite kind to the children. A couple years ago, I saw more and more orders of what they call voluntary departure, saying you can go back home, but the kids don't go back home, and it turns into a deportation order, right? What I saw in court was sort of surprising, somewhat reassuring, and disturbing. They're closing all those cases. The majority of those kids don't have lawyers. The judges can't sit there and determine whether or not those children have protection needs, right? But they're feeling bad and they're closing the cases. So that means the file gets sent away and ICE can reopen the file at any point. So I'm happy they're not issuing voluntary departure orders and they're not getting deportation, but I'm concerned that these kids actually might have a basis to stay here legally, okay? So they're the immigration courts, and the courts also recognized a couple years ago that they needed somebody at headquarters to look at these issues. So they finally appointed an assistant chief immigration judge in charge of vulnerable populations, but it's only one person, right? And we got 127,000 kids coming next year. So it's one person, and she's fantastic. She's from our, she historically NGO community, very smart. She's done international issues, but she's one person, okay? So she's in charge of looking at those issues. Now, what's interesting, in EOIR, that's the Executive Office for Immigration Review, in charge of all the immigration courts, did issue procedures for, addressing unaccompanied minors in court. So it's nice. It says, be nice to them. You can have toys in there. Make sure don't scare them. You don't have to wear your robes. But it's very clear that it says that the Immigration and Nationality Act, the law, governs their claims, not the best interest of the child. Okay, so the best interest of the child only governs in being nice to them, frankly. Okay, so I just want to talk very quickly about relief from removal, what I do when the kids come in and I see them. there's a couple different things. So I look at whether or not there's something called the Special Immigrant Juvenile Visa, which is wonderful, fantastic, and we use quite a bit. That is if, so that provides a green card for unaccompanied minors or minors. So what it means is if you can show that a child has been abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both parents, and it's not in their best interest to reunite them, and you get an order, you can go to immigration and say, please give them the green card. Now that sounds wonderful. It's a hugely complicated process, lots of moving parts. You have to go to family court first, okay, to get a judge to agree. What I see more and more is that the judges are much more open to these and are trying to do their best to protect the kids. And in fact, the young man I told you about in the beginning, his parents sent him because they loved him, okay? They loved him. They wanted him to come to America and be safe and finish school. I had a hard time in court, I mean a somewhat difficult time, because I was in the position and I was very forthright with the judge saying, these parents love him, but they neglected him by sending him on this, this 25-day journey, right? And the judge was torn as well, and she said, I recognize they love him, but I'm going to sign this order, which is what he needed, right, folks? So the judge is doing it, but it's a very complicated process, so keep this in mind to the end when I tell you about challenges. Another thing is asylum. So I'll talk to the children and see whether or not they have a possibility for asylum, right? The problem with asylum, and I think Mark touched on this, is the issue about the case law, right? So most of my kids are coming because they're afraid of gangs. And they've been witnesses, or the girls have been targeted, or the boys have been targeted for recruitment, right? Or la renta. The family is being forced to give money every month. And they don't necessarily, they certainly don't, most of them fit into the published case law, okay? But I have hope, and this is the practitioner in me, it's not the, I have hope because there's judges. I always tell my team at work, you have to tell a good story, right? Because there's wonderful immigration judges too, and asylum officers. And if you present a really compelling case, and can make a legal argument that they do fit into the category, immigration judges across the country are granting in unpublished decisions asylum claims, okay? And there was one judge in Baltimore that granted one to a young, I think he found a particular social group, although I think maybe I'm legally wrong, but she has her asylum and her green card, young Salvadoran women who suffered rape and sexual violence by gang members, okay? So there's great unpublished decisions. I think it's on U.S. Committee for Refugees website. So there are judges that are granting quietly. There's asylum officers who are granting quietly too. We had a young woman who was a witness, a STAR student in Salvador, and she witnessed bad gang activity, and they granted hers no problem. So we are winning these cases. But published cases, there are published cases to guide them. And this is sort of part of the fear factor when you're representing people, or when we're trying to get pro bono attorneys, they get nervous, they get scared because they think, oh my gosh, the law's so bad. I always say, just be brave. If you have compelling circumstances, you will win this case, or you'll shame the government, So there's challenges with the gang cases. Some of the issues I see, and this is as a community we have to deal with, is access to counsel. So, I represent a lot of people who years later told me, they never knew they had asylum claim. My young LGBT folks, right? Kids that come across the border that are 15 have no idea they can do that, and nobody's talking to them because CBP has been criticized, strongly criticized over the last couple of years for not asking people if they're afraid, right? So there's not enough capacity in DC, which is a big metropolis, a big city. We have lots of resources. It's the tip of the iceberg that we can represent. We have Catholic Charities, we have KIND, we have big law firms who want to do the right thing, and we can't do it. When I was in the Juvenile Docket last week, I think maybe 10% of the kids were represented, right? It was a very low number, okay? There are people in different jurisdictions that are trying to change that. There's ALIM members, the American Immigration Lawyers Association in New York has created a juvenile docket system, a way to meet with the kids in court, assess, do a summary, and then try to get pro bono attorneys. Pro bono issues and issues and problems. So you get an attorney that wants to take a case, well that's great, but then they end up having to take the entire family. So these are just issues to think about, folks, when we're thinking about advocacy. Because attorneys get afraid. They might be able to take a child, but maybe they won't be able to take the whole family. We end up taking the whole family, and it's fine, but my firm has resources. Also, SIJS cases, which are one of the most important ones, one of the best forms of relief, it requires you to be barred in the jurisdiction where you practice, and a lot of immigration attorneys aren't, so that's a challenge. And then finally, what do you do if there's no relief available? I'm happy the courts close cases, but that's not a long-term solution. Okay, thank you very much, folks.
Yeah, one of the things I think this discussion highlights is that we are pretty short-sighted a lot of times in our deportation policies here in the United States. We have had a huge emphasis on deporting gang members over the years, and I think one of the most interesting graphics I saw once was in the Atlantic magazine. They did a graph of the rise of MS-13, and it directly correlated to deportations of gang members. Because what was happening was the United States government was taking these teenage boys and deporting them as gang members back to El Salvador. They would drop them off on the runway, with no money, no support system, no network. And MS-13 was there to say, hey, this deportation flight is a great source of recruits. We're signing you guys up. We're going to be your family. We're going to be your support network. We're going to feed you and house you. And all you got to do is join our gang and run drugs back into the United States and be part of our. So they were actively recruiting from our deportation flights. From the United States. So MS-13 got really powerful because of our deportation, and what did we do in response to that? Instead of trying to fix the gang problem here in America, we decided to just deport it. And now that these large numbers of gang members are being deported, they are now causing, to some extent, the flood of people coming towards our border again. But nobody's looking at the big picture and trying to figure out whether there's a better solution to fixing this problem rather than just exporting it and then having it go back to haunt us. So I find that really interesting how this thing seems to be playing out, second and third order side effects, I guess.
Right. And there's a couple of really good, for example, I'd recommend that folks watch, one's a movie and one's a documentary. There's a movie called Sin Nombre that I'd like to show to all immigration judges when I represent, gang-based asylum claims, because it's the strongest argument for a particular social group of young boys, maybe young boys living with a grandmother, right? And how the gangs target them. But also there's another National Geographic documentary, and I forget the name, I think it's MS-13, and that shows exactly what happened. That as soon as we started the deportations, and we created that problem in Central America through the deportations in the 70s. So it was really interesting.
Everyone, welcome to questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Mark Noble with CMS. It's actually a question for you. Could you talk more about kind efforts for appointing counsel for unaccompanied minors? And really more politically and logistically, is it feasible? What do you see as the barriers, and what's Kind doing right now on that issue?
Sure. Thank you. Yes, Kind is a public-private partnership, and we find attorneys among law firms, corporations, and law schools who volunteer to take cases referred to us. We're referred cases, the majority of cases are from HHS as they're leaving their custody and coming to reunite with a sponsor. That's when we get a referral. And we have over 200 partners who we then go to try to get a lawyer for the child. And it's been working very well up till, I think, about 2012 when the numbers, or late 2011 when the numbers started to skyrocket of children. We've gotten an amazing response from the private sector, but at this point it's not enough. And so in terms of advocacy and kind of what we're doing, we're trying to, we've been advocating for appointed counsel for children and requiring counsel for children. So that could be a mix of private pro bono representation and attorneys appointed by the government for cases particularly that are need an attorney very, very fast, maybe are particularly complex and would take a lot of resources and a lot of time. So that's what we're hoping for at this point, but we have a ways to go, I think.
Could I ask a question? What percentage of minors are represented?
Well, that's a good question. We had been saying up to the surge about half and post-kind. But then with the surge, the numbers are, as we say, through the roof, and no one really has good statistics, but just, I think, from our, back of the envelope kind of calculation, maybe 70 to 80% do not at this point have, because there's been no additional funding, through this crisis for any kind of legal services for children to gain attorneys after they've been released.
Hi, I'm Judy Rabinovitz of ACLU, Immigrants' Rights Project. So I had two questions. One is about the return of Mexican children, because I thought that the TVPRA was supposed to be addressing that, and so I just want to understand, is it that it's being violated, or is it that the statute doesn't protect, what's happening? And the second question is just a follow-up of the one that you just were responding to, Megan, about, the percentage of unrepresentation and how that's likely to increase. And so I guess I wondered, Anna, what you think is, or any of you, what you think is the response? If you're there, can we legitimately be demanding at this point that the government provide counsel for these hundreds of thousands of people? And if they can't provide counsel, what is the answer? Because it sounds like you're concerned that if a case is closed, you'd prefer the case be closed and that the person be ordered removed or get VD, but that then they're in this limbo. So is there something else to deal with? To deal with the situation where we have so many numbers, yes, ideally we would like counsel for everyone. Alternatively, we'd like something that says they can't go forward with removal proceedings if they don't have counsel. And then what? Then what to do to protect them?
Okay, just the TVPRA and screening Mexican kids, that's been an issue, long-standing issue since the passage of TVPRA. Advocates have been very concerned that the screening is not effective, and down at the very, the level on the ground, that it just hasn't been happening as it should be. And we think with these numbers, that's only increasing, the pressure to not let people into the country, let children into the country.
So basically, Mexican unaccompanied children are in a worse position than other unaccompanied children. They're getting removed.
They can just be returned if they're not found to have a fear of return, if they're not at risk of trafficking, or if there's not a trafficking concern and it seems that they can make an independent decision, they can be returned immediately. And another interesting point, we don't know, these numbers are hard to pin down because we also don't know who's coming back, that they come and they go back, so it's a very difficult situation.
And I just had a couple of comments, Judy, because it is interesting, because the truth is, so if we're going to get 127,000 kids and we're going to say, should they have counsel? I think in the best world, they should have counsel, but I also understand the government's going to say, if people start hearing that counsel is assigned to unaccompanied minors as soon as they reach the border, I think that the government probably has legitimate fears that, it might double to 300,000 because there is so much violence and there is needs and people will find a way, because my families find a way to get those kids up here because they're scared to death. So more numbers will find as long as they have the means to send their kids up. Very little means. So I do think it's a real concern, but they're just kicking the ball or kicking the can down the court, frankly, because if you don't have counsel, what it is these numbers of administrative closures are going up. I'm all right with it. I'm a practitioner. I'm not a policymaker, right? But at the end of the day, they're going to have to deal with it, right? And then also, I think this is what we said, we signed conventions. This is a humanitarian crisis. These kids are in need. I wouldn't want that happening to my child. And I feel like we have to call on that. I know maybe it's sort of hippie from the 70s, or I don't know how I grew up, but you can't harm a child. You absolutely can't. You just have to say no. So, I feel like it's the policy folks and the research folks who are really going to have to push this, but it's kicking the can down the road, and it's going to explode at some point. EOIR, if I'm a judge, I don't want all those admin number closures on my docket. I want to resolve.
So what?
I think we have to push for assigned counsel. I think law students should only do 2 years of school, and third year should be required, and they shouldn't have to pay tuition, and they should do that third year providing legal services. And we can send people to the border, we can send people to the prisons, we can send people everywhere when we create a core. So that's my
I hate to ask a question after that. I'm Mary Small with Desert Refugee Service. My question is about the usage of SIJVs and fully appreciating the complexity of that and the fact that that's often the most effective route for kids. I was wondering what impact findings of neglect, abandonment, or abuse have on parental rights and future family reunification options.
They cut it off.
Yeah.
So, in fact, this is one of the other second and third order consequences. Everybody's going for SIJs now, special immigrant juvenile, because these other options don't work as well. Irony of all ironies, everybody's using SIJ now because of the Hague Convention on adoption. Is that ironic or what? Because we passed the Hague Convention and now people can't adopt kids that are living in the United States without going through the Hague procedure. So now they're going into special immigrant juvenile and cutting off the parental rights that way, before they do the adoption, because it's all really, nobody's looking at the big picture here. The biggest thing we could do to solve this problem would be to fix the legal immigration system. If we finally come to grips with the fact that our legal immigration system is completely dysfunctional and broken and we fix it, we have a legal way for people to come to the United States and work, we have a legal way for them to bring their families here that doesn't take 15 or 20 years, that's going to take a lot of the pressure off. I don't know the people you're talking to, but a lot of these kids that I talk to have family in America.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
they're on a waiting list, or the parents are here but can't go back home because they can't cross the border again because they got an unlawful presence problem. So the kids are being brought across because the family wants to be reunited and the family's stuck here. The breadwinner came across, can't go back home anymore, and they're bringing the kids across. If the legal system worked, they wouldn't be applying for asylum, they wouldn't be seeking to be classified as refugees, they would simply, reunite with their family here in America, with the parents, and go on and do what your ancestors did.
Borrowed his cousin John's bank account.
Right.
Now, just one thing about that, I have to say as a practitioner, and I don't know if you feel the same way, Margaret, I feel uncomfortable and sad that I have to demonize the parents when I go into court. I feel very uncomfortable with that. So, but the kids need status, and I explain to the parents, so.
Thanks. My name is Andy Summers, and I'm a practitioner up in Maine at ILAP, the Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project. So I have a question for Megan and Anna specifically. I think we're also seeing an increasing number of unaccompanied minors, just like everyone else, both from Africa and Central America and Mexico, because our population is largely African in Maine. And so the way we're still able to handle the cases that are coming to us through our staff and our pro bono panel, what we do though is that we don't do the probate or family court piece of it. We require kind of a collaboration with a family practitioner. And I'm curious if you were involved with DHHS and kind of that advocacy to kind of be that funnel, because we're nowhere near that in Maine. And as a matter of fact, we kind of get these predicate orders without talking about the immigration law at all, because we feel like that would be poisoning our cases. And so we're putting in these special findings and helping the family court practitioners do that. DHHS is refusing to even take 17-year-olds into state care. They feel like they're so close to the age of majority that they won't even consider those cases. So we're really at a place that our pressing issue is advocacy within the family court system and within the state. And I'm curious if in the history, since we're kind of behind, was that part of what your organizations did, and how did you work through that?
Well, I can just say yes. That is a problem, and just in terms of legal services, we are, we're seeing, we're funded in part by government, and there's been restrictions on the kids we can accept, by age. So that's an issue that we have been trying to address in our advocacy. As well, but with the increasing numbers, it's very difficult to do that. I think I'll leave it there at this point. I have colleagues here if anybody wants to add anything.
I'm sorry. I think that's interesting with the family court issue. I think that it's important to get the family attorneys and see if you can form a partnership with, and like you're doing. We don't do that. That's a great idea to find it, the family bar association, whatever it is, and work closely with them if they could do that piece. But another thing, in Maryland, they did great advocacy and passed the law that
I read
makes,
about
you know,
this.
the family court proceedings up to age 21.
It's fantastic.
So I feel like that's a real model, and there's an attorney called Michelle Mendes, she's fantastic, from Catholic Charities in Silver Spring, Maryland, who is sort of very expert in that and was involved in that. So, I mean, I feel like,
Yeah, and that's something, you know, we have been doing trainings, trying to do trainings with family court judges across the country to educate them, because we have had situations where, you know, the family court judge says, why is this child in my court? But we've also, and it's been interesting, we've been having a growing problem in some areas too with SIJ, where when it proceeds to the I-360 stage of questioning the predicate order and trying to go kind of beneath it and ask that it basically be re-adjudicated once again. So that's something.
thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Todd Scribner from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. This is somewhat of a perennial question that I'm wondering if one of you have a silver bullet answer for. Perhaps not, perhaps so. You know, Anna Gallagher mentioned the fact that, you know, over the recent years, enforcement has increased dramatically, more border guards, more walls, more obstacles to try and prevent people from coming in illegally. And that's really a reactionary response to a pre-existing problem that's starting elsewhere. And so I'm wondering what kind of policies that some of you see the United States could put into place. What can agencies do? What can countries of origins do to address the root causes that really drive this kind of migration in the first place? I mean, we're talking about, you know, gangs. We're talking about, you know, domestic violence. I mean, if you can't stop that, you really can't stop the problem from continuing. And so I guess rather than going on, what do you all see could be actually done to address it effectively from the start?
My favorite thing is I think before they deport somebody, they ought to consider the impact on the deportation to the country. You know, what's going to happen in the country if this person gets deported? Are we breaking up a family by deporting this person? Are we deporting a breadwinner and therefore, you know, the United States family is going to all go out and apply for public assistance and not have support, and they're going to, you know, we're going to traumatize people. I mean, it's really amazing to me that we think we're somehow solving a problem by getting rid of people. You know, let's get people out of our country and somehow that's going to solve a problem. And most of the time it seems to just create more problems. At least that's what I've observed in the last few years. So I'd like to see a return to a system where they consider, you know, all the factors a court would normally consider when handling a case. You know, the equities of the case when making a decision about what we're going to do about people. You know, rather than just having these blind rules that we apply.
Well, you know what, I think that's a great idea. I think they should be required to do, it should be written into the statute, a final humanitarian impact assessment, right?
Well, our best interests of the family or,
right.
You know, something.
No, but I mean, there was one case we had, I mean, this was before the softer, gentler enforcement guidelines of a primary breadwinner, married to a DV survivor, you know, 3 kids. He was deported. Kids had psychological problems. The wife went into deep depression. They had to access all the Medicaid, Medicare, No Say K, you know, all that. And then it's a huge cost. So I think that, and then I'm going to say something, another really hippie sort of thing to say, true economic and social justice. You know, if we looked at that and find the country's origin, I mean, we wouldn't have as many problems. So.
And I'm still waiting for someone to take the 1996 immigration law and do a cost-benefit analysis and go, was it worth it? You know, when you hear the debates on that law and what it was going to accomplish, it completely backfired. And yet today we're still trying to defend the thing. You know, whatever happened to repealing the 1996 law in toto, maybe, you know, and just go back to the system we had before because it worked better than what we got out of 96, and yet we keep trying to make things tougher and tougher and tougher.
I'm Karen Grisey from Washington, D.C., and I wanted to follow up a bit on the theme that's run through both panels, which has to do with people being blocked actually from making their claims. Anna mentioned CBP in this context, and Mark talked earlier about when credible fear interviews go wrong and there's no record, they can't go anywhere. What I want to ask is, we know that CBP dissuades people at the point of entry from making asylum claims, or when they begin to articulate a claim, they tell them that's no good, you can't get asylum for that, particularly in the Mexican context, but others too, or they tell them, you know, you can say that, but you're gonna go to the really big prison, or you're gonna be detained for a really long time, all those kind of statements. So my question is, with regard to the kids and these terrifying projections about the increase in numbers, do we think that most of the children presenting are actually making their way into the system and that those numbers are valid, or do we think that there are children who are subject to this same kind of turning away, turning back, or dissuasion at the border?
Well, the children, you know, so Mexican children, you know, it's different from the treatment of children at the border, Mexican children and other than Mexican children. So if when Border Patrol screens Mexican child and, you know, doesn't find those 3 points, then they are, you know, returned. And children from other countries, if they're deemed to be unaccompanied, then they do go into HHS custody. They're held in Border Patrol for 72 hours, and then they are moved to HHS custody. Does that answer your question?
So you think it's happening as it should, though? That the questions and the screening?
Well, I wouldn't say that, but because there's still a lot of it, we're still missing. I mean, for example, you know, particularly vulnerable children are missed in this quick process. You know, they get a very, you know, Border Patrol, you know, a young child, they're not going to get any answers, and so they go to the HHS facility, and the child, a girl may be pregnant, or, you know, just been assaulted, or other situations that may not be known for a while because of this screening is ineffective. And particularly now we're concerned because all the screening is happening much more quickly, because the pressure is to just move the kids out. You know, the kids are backing up in Border Patrol, and just get them out. And then when they're at HHS, it's just get them out. We don't have enough beds, get them out. So.
And then also, I was going to add, you know, a lot of these kids, I mean, because it is going so quickly, and there's no, I mean, that's why you need counsel. I mean, because especially girls with gender issues, right? Or, and this is a waste of government money, LGBT. I had a 15-year-old that came over. He had no clue that as a young gay man who had suffered significant persecution in his home country, that he should have said he was afraid to go back because of that. So he didn't understand it. So I feel like there's this, and especially vulnerable groups, so and the ones perhaps that should be most protected are getting the least access, I suppose.
Hi, I'm Claire Bergeron from Migration Policy Institute in DC. So quick question really, I think for any of you guys. I was curious if the increase in children has translated into increased delays at the court level, particularly if we're dealing with courts that oftentimes have a juvenile docket specifically, and if you see these sorts of administrative closures as sort of fixing that problem somewhat in terms of delays, and that the case perhaps does not take as long, or not doing much about it at all.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, our cases are being scheduled, you know, to 2016 or beyond. So, yeah, it's absolutely affecting it. And, you know, as was said earlier, some of these children, if they, you know, close the case, they may have cases, or it's not, you know, they have no, this doesn't give them any particular protection and access to benefits or anything like that. So that is not, you know.
Yeah, one thing they could do, which I don't know why they're not doing it, is to simply, you know, you were talking about treating them as defensive cases, but why not have a change so that if you're under 18 and you have passed a credible fear interview, you get an interview with an asylum officer who's specially trained to deal with child claims, and don't just dump them on to the immigration courts. You know, I mean, that would prevent this flood, and the immigration courts are totally backed up all over the country right now. It's just, you know, ridiculous, and they're not getting the funding, and it's not going to get any better.
And the judges don't like these cases either, right? So, and a lot of them feel very badly.
Hi, I'm Nancy Heapster of Stony Brook University. This is a question that might be a little bit peripheral, but I think it's somehow related. I've been following the actions of the Dreamers, like the Dream 9, the Dream 30. I think there's even a bigger number now that have been, you know, coming up to the border and claiming asylum and then going into detention and going through that process. And I'm curious, how do you see those these kind of activist actions affecting the way policymakers are looking at asylum or way that asylum claims are handled, kind of using asylum almost as an activist tool?
I don't know, I'll take a step. I bet it scares them. I mean, it scares the policymakers, right? And it probably scares, I mean, even people within the, the pro-immigrant community get nervous because they think that, I mean, some conservative, I would say more conservative people, think that, if you're coming, it might be hinting at, maybe it's a frivolous claim. Well, I mean, what I see from these kids, it's not a frivolous claim. I don't know what you guys think.
I mean, it points out the problem of just isolating the asylum and refugee system as like one little piece of things. You have to look at the big picture. And why are the dreamers doing this? Because we won't fix the legal immigration system. We won't give them some kind of avenue to get here legally, even though the DREAM Act is, a long time ago was bipartisan and everybody agreed on it, and it was supposed to be this pretty easy solution that we just can't seem to pass. I think it does concern people when the asylum and refugee system starts being used as a pressure point, because obviously it undermines some of the principles and objectives, but I can see why people are doing it. In fact, there's a retired Border Patrol agent who is going around actively giving speeches and telling everybody from Mexico to apply for asylum, because he says that this is the way to fix the problems down on the border, is to have everyone flood the system, and the system will be completely overwhelmed, and that will force policymakers to actually deal with the problem that they refuse to deal with right now. This guy's a retired Border Patrol agent. Go check him out on the internet.
I think that I agree. I definitely agree with what Margaret said about the issue of treating this as the asylum and refugee issue as independent from the entire system. I haven't really seen how policy itself has reacted to it. The only kind of policy maker reaction I've seen is kind of a negative one, to be honest. It's though I think people acknowledge that these kids have a legitimate beef with the system generally, as far as I've seen and as I've heard, their asylum claims don't look like they're winners. And so what you get is policymakers, conservative policymakers, picking this out as ways of abuse of the asylum system in order to kind of get into the US and go. So that's what I've seen. I don't know if actual policy has been made around this, but that's the reaction I've seen to this action.
Okay, we'll take our last question.
Hi, I'm Brian Lonigan from USCIS, Refugee and Asylum Law Division, Office of Chief Counsel. I have a very long business card. I wish CIS, I'm here speaking on my own capacity, not on behalf of the agency, of course, but I really wish somebody from the agency was here, because I don't agree 100% with a lot of what's been said here. Well, for one thing, everybody should realize that under the TVPA, the asylum offices now have original jurisdiction. It's not as if the EOIR is closing cases and they're just sitting there. It's and they're languishing at the EOIR. They're now with the asylum office where they're languishing. So the original jurisdiction is now with the asylum office for the reason that we want to try to do things in the best interest of the child. The idea that people are somehow being turned away in mass numbers who deserve protection, I think is not quite accurate. Our affirmative applications are where they have been for a number of years, but you should keep in mind that 5 years ago, reasonable fear interviews were about 700 people per year. They're now 9,000. Credible fear went from 7,000 to 13,000 last year to 13,000 2 years ago to 36,000 last year, and God knows where we're going to be today. And we've all heard the numbers of unaccompanied children. I don't even know where we're going to put them. The point is that the asylum offices are being deluged. Our entire, unfortunately right now, all we do is credible fear. And we've heard the numbers of 90% approval, frankly, to fail credible fear is like failing to get out of jury duty. You really have to work at it. The people who are, I've been watching credible fear interviews, the people who are not passing are ones who are saying, frankly, I have no reason to apply for asylum. They actually come out and say it. Otherwise, if you can say, well, you know, there was a gang, boom, you're getting passed, even though the BIA has now put some curbs on gang-related claims. My point is that people are getting heard, and people are being processed, and people are getting through this system, only to then be backloaded into the immigration court where they're going to have to languish for years. But it's not as hopeless a situation as I think they've been painting.
Can I, just a quick comment. I actually think I have very positive experiences with the USCIS and the asylum office, so I have very little complaints. But the admin closures, what was interesting to me, Brian, with that one was that it was, it was an asylum. They weren't closing them because of asylum reasons. Because for asylum reason, I'm thrilled, you know, send them back, and we have cases like that. But they weren't closing them. They were just admin closing them because their aunt was in the courtroom, because they had a little brother or sister, which I'm not complaining about that. But what concerns me is the council issue, and that's not your fault. It's the council issue. Because, and also the kids coming to the border are the ones that aren't getting asked questions or don't even know, and people are busy, right? And they're usually the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. So that's my concern. And the kids that are up there in court, you know, that aren't getting asylum, you know, they may have relief. And we're just kicking the can down the road. But that has nothing to do with USCIS asylum, because by and large, I'm good with you guys. You know?
Okay, there. Thank you very much.